비트코인 조정이 끝나지 않고 있습니다. 실은 전체적인 가상화폐의 가치가 하락을 맞고 있는데요. 주식과 달리 개인 투자자들이 하락에 대한 이유를 알기 어려운 시장인 만큼 답답함이 더해지고 있습니다. 여기 JP모건 수석 전략가 출신이자 현재 이더리움 트레저리 기업 비트마인 의장으로도 유명한 톰 리는 지금 시장에 대해 어떻게 생각하고 있을까요? 빠르게 인터뷰 한번 보도록 하겠습니다.
Ether's down 8.5% this week. Bitcoin's down 8. Bitmine is down 20. What's happening here?
Scott, I think we're still seeing the repercussions of that April 10th crypto deleveraging event. It was the biggest deleveraging event ever. And there are still, I think, some market makers that have some balance sheet issues that are trying to raise capital. So I think that this is leading to a market that is kind of raised. Every time we get a bit of a rally, there's some capital trying to be raised. And I think that's what's suppressing crypto for now. That's, of course, going to end soon, but I think that's led to why crypto has underperformed equities since October 10th.
Can crypto treasuries like yours, for example, can they trade as well or in tandem with a cryptocurrency itself, or does one have to trade at the expense of the other? If I'm going to see money flow into Bitcoin or crypto treasuries, wouldn't it then come out of the actual pure play coin itself?
Not exactly, Scott. For instance, when Bitmine has shareholders and institutional capital comes in and, JP Morgan, Invesco, BlackRock are buying big stakes, then that capital is then used to buy Ethereum. So it's actually going back into the ecosystem, but then it's going into a vehicle like Bitmine that's actually a permanent holder. Bitmine owns 3.5 million Ethereum, more than 2.9% of the supply, but now that is not going to be subject to liquidations because there's no leverage used to hold that Ethereum. And then at some point, that 3.6 million or 3.5 million Ethereum is going to be staked and then generate, nearly $400 million in net income. Well, that can create returns for shareholders. So in a way, a crypto treasury is actually a pretty attractive equity because there's an income component, plus there's, of course, that ability to grow your Ethereum holdings per share.
What if crypto treasuries become more favored than crypto itself? There's no negative impact for either the way that Ether or Bitcoin would trade if just more money floods towards the treasury part of this story?
Well, one, it's a conduit because, as you know, equity managers, many of them, the 4,000, can't own crypto directly. So they have to get exposure to Ethereum by buying a stock like Bitmine. And Bitmine is the 438th largest stock in America today. It's not that different than if someone wanted to have exposure to energy, they can buy oil and trade a commodity, or they can take like oil barrels at home, or they can buy an oil-related stock, either a major or something in the supply chain. That's what crypto treasuries are, is essentially an asset class that gives you direct exposure to the crypto asset.
All right, let's pivot to the market itself. Is your confidence at all shaken in where we are and what you thought the prospects for an end-of-year run could be?
Well, it's never fun to see markets wobble and then stocks that are quite popular like AI and the quantums and nuclear come down so hard. But it is consistent with the idea that, we were up 6 months through October, so the market's overbought. We expected 2 weeks of consolidation, which is what we're getting. And then, of course, as you know, there's hawkish Fed talk, so there's a bit of a tantrum the market's having. But between now and year end, we still have really good seasonals. The earnings have been good. Sentiment has flipped negative, Scott, as you could tell. I mean, the AAII went to negative 17.5. So I'd say the risk reward is still really good for equities into year end. And yeah, I think the S&P will be over 7,000 by the end of the year, in fact, maybe over 7,000 by the end of the month.
The things that really matter. We're trying to change the way people invest in terms of thinking not only about long term, but we're really trying to get people to think about the super cycles. The super cycles are intact. So that's why we're not worried. There are walls of worry growing. That's what you're going to hear from folks. And those are going to give you chances to buy stocks. And thirdly, just keep in mind the risk reward's positive. I'd say that we still think November is going to be an up month. With a lot of confidence. And the first reason for that is that stocks are up 6 months in a row, and it's almost going to strengthen the case for November to be positive. But we know it's going to be choppy. We think it's a choppy first 2 weeks, but then we ultimately end up, over 200 points on the S&P. That would take us past 7,000. And these are the 6 years that I think are precedent markets. These are the times where the markets were up May through October. And you can see that the November to December, which is far on the far right, has been positive, except in 1936 when the markets basically were flat. I think we're in a very different place. That was post-depression period. We're really in the middle of an upcycle. I still think we're going to be at least 7,000 by year end, maybe 7,300. And if you think what's late cycle, just keep in mind that ISM is still below 50, 33 months now. We've never been top of the market when the ISM is below 50. I think we're far from a bubble today. Margins are expanding, and I think it's very telling because earlier this year, you remember the consensus from the Fed was that someone has to pay for these tariffs. So inflation would go up and margins would get squeezed. But in the third quarter of this year, which is in the full force of tariffs, companies taking 67% of that hit, earnings grew faster than revenues. 7 out of 11 sectors had margins expanding. And there's a fund manager chase that's going to happen into year end. So everyone will say, you're going to hear someone tell you, everyone's bullish, Tom. That's not true, because if they were bullish, their performance would be outperforming the S&P this year. And as you can see, 22% of active funds are trailing their benchmark this year. So it's been a bad year for fund managers. And now we have this huge wall of worry. And this is what I think we have to be working our way through. I think it is helpful to think about where we are in the cycle. I know the Fed is a little hesitant. The reason to cut in December, but the reason they're hesitant to cut is the economy is actually pretty healthy, and they just don't have a clear contour of how quickly inflation's cooling. That's a very good backdrop for corporate earnings, actually even corporate earnings to actually start to spread. So if the Fed gives us some guidance and visibility about path forward, I do think business confidence picks up. That means that ISM starts to recover, and it is a broadening trade. So I would agree with the other speaker that I like tech structurally because of AI spending. I think from a market's perspective and from the economy's perspective, we know that high rates are actually causing something that I think the Fed actually has some can actually have some impact on. So I do think it makes sense for the Fed to cut.
톰 리는 지금 시장이 아직도 레버리지 청산의 후유증이 남아있다고 이야기하며 10월 10일 관세 이슈로 시장에 큰 조정이 온 이후로 가상화폐가 주식 대비 상대적인 약세를 보이고 있다고 이야기했습니다. 하지만 시장을 봤을 때 이미 과열되어 있던 시장이었기 때문에 조정은 예정된 수순이었다고 설명했는데요. 결국 기관 투자자들이 연말에 공격적으로 시장에 참여할 수밖에 없다며 연말 랠리에 대해 기대를 잊지 않았습니다. 하지만 제 채널에 등장하는 전문가들은 대부분 비트코인을 좋게 이야기해야 하는 위치에 있는 사람들이죠. 고객 자금을 굴리고 있거나 회사 자금으로 비트코인을 구매한 사람들이 많기 때문이죠. 시장에는 정답질환 없습니다. 아무리 전문가라지만 남이 하는 좋은 말만 들어서는 투자에 성공할 수 없겠죠. 제가 구독자분들이 객관적으로 비트코인을 판단하실 수 있게 2025년과 2026년 비트코인 전망 자료집을 만들었는데요. 자료집 안에는 국가별 비트코인 보유량과 평단가, 그리고 마이클 세일러가 운영하는 스트래티지 같은 트레저리 전략을 펼치는 기업들의 보유량과 평단가를 한눈에 보실 수 있게 차트에 표시해 두었고요. 날짜별로 비트코인 시장에 어떤 일이 있었는지도 따로 표시해 두어서 추후에 적어도 비트코인에 호재나 악재가 생겼을 때 참고하실 수 있겠죠. 그리고 가장 중요한 건 아직까지 많은 분들이 비트코인의 정확한 가치를 잘 모르시거나 비트코인은 주식이나 금에 비해 변동성이 너무 심해서 사기다 라는 말을 철석같이 믿고 비트코인을 자산 포트폴리오에서 배제하시는 분들이 많더라고요. 객관적인 사실을 살펴보실 수 있게 연도별 주요 자산 상승률과 하락률을 비교 차트로 만들어 두었고요. 받아보시는 방법은 간단합니다. 첫 번째로 구독과 좋아요 눌러주시고 제가 구독자 마크 확인할 수 있게 댓글에 대응이라고 2글자 남겨주시고
지금 보시는 영상 하단 더보기란과 고정 댓글에 남겨져 있는 이 앤드류 커뮤니티 입장 링크 눌러주시고요. 이렇게 구독자 전용 이벤트 신청서가 나오게 되는데 여기 기타 부분을 체크해주신 뒤에 대응이라고 2글자 적어주시고요. 전화번호 적어주신 뒤에 제출까지 눌러주시면 제가 구독자분 마크 확인하고 이 대응 자료집을 보내드리도록 하겠습니다. 자, 그리고 저희 구독자분들이 가장 많이 신청 주시고 있는 이 앤드류 자동매매 프로그램 구독자분들 딱 10분께만 더 공유를 해드리기로 했습니다. 자, 이 자동매매 프로그램의 성과는 지금 총 손익이 1000%를 넘었고요. 개인 투자자분들이 가장 못하는 이 우상향하는 자산을 끝까지 끌고 가지 못하는 그런 감정적인 부분을 배제할 수 있는 프로그램입니다. 프로그램 로직은요, 저희 트레이딩팀에서 사용하는 약 13가지의 복합적인 지표를 넣어서요, 속임수를 거르고 상승 추세가 확실하게 나왔을 때만 진입을 하게 되고요, 매수와 매도, 익절과 손절 그 모든 과정이 차트에 이렇게 표시가 되는데, 차트 표시뿐만 아니라 저희 구독자분들이라면 누구라도 이 하단에 거래 목록을 누르시면 이 프로그램이 몇 날 몇 시에 얼마에 사서 얼마에 팔았는지까지 정확하게 보실 수가 있습니다. 자, 프로그램의 성과를 보시면요, 손절은 이렇게 10%, 5%, 많을 때는 18% 이렇게 짧게 끊고요, 수익이 나는 폭을 보시면 8%, 34% 그리고 또 많을 때는 300%가 넘는 이런 수익을 내기도 합니다. 자, 인간의 감정을 배제하고 높게 올라갈 수 있는 종목의 수익은 끝까지 끌고 가기 때문에 이런 좋은 성과가 날 수 있게 되는 거고요. 저희 구독자분들 중에서 본업이 바쁘셔서 좀 투자하시기가 어려운 분들, 꼭 자동 매매를 해야 되겠다 하시는 분들만 신청을 주시면 좋을 것 같습니다. 자, 자동 매매 프로그램 받으시는 법도 굉장히 간단합니다. 똑같이 좋아요와 구독 눌러주셔야 되는데요, 제가 구독자 마크를 확인할 수 있게 댓글에 자동이라고 꼭 2글자 남겨주시고요. 마찬가지로 보시는 영상 하단 더보기란과 고정 댓글에 나와 있는 링크 눌러주시고, 이렇게 구독자 이벤트 신청서에서 3번째에 있는 알파빗 오토 자동매매 지표 받기 눌러주시고요, 전화번호 남겨주시고 제출까지 눌러주시면 제가 댓글에서 구독자 마크 확인하고 이 자동매매 지표를 보내드리도록 하겠습니다.